Hello, good evening everybody. Welcome to this webinar this evening. So tonight we are going to be looking at analysing potential changes to your farm system. So this one builds on to the previous one. So it's the second in the series, and this one teaches how to convert an existing Farmax farm into a long-term model to analyse a range of farm system changes such as adjusting stock policies, purchasing land or changing lease block arrangements. So this webinar will cover converting a farm from short-term to long-term, balancing crops and feeds, aging stock and balancing animal numbers, creating a simple scenario, comparing a scenario to a base file for decision making. And so it really builds on the farm model that we created in webinar 1, and it's linked into a bee farm down in Dorset. So my name is Liz Jennifer, and shortly I shall hand you over to Jack, who will be taking you through this evening's webinar. So thanks, Jack. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Liz. It's a very thorough introduction. I don't say much. Let's get straight into it.
I may have read it, sorry.
No, that's absolutely fine. So, again, good evening, everyone. As Liz has said, we're going to be working through the Bowden farm model today. And for those of you who've already got Farmax downloaded, I've linked the base farm for you to use for this webinar. So, as always, you're welcome to tune into this webinar and use it as a method of going through Farmax at the same time. So you can have Farmax open and work through the activity sheet while we're doing the webinar. Otherwise, you might want to just watch this webinar and then go ahead and go through the worksheet yourself afterwards. And if there's anyone that wants to get linked up to Farmax and doesn't yet have it, just let me know and I can also give you access to these training farms and training files. So, as Liz said, we're looking at short-term versus long-term today, and I'll start just with a little bit of a brief of what that actually means. So, short-term in Farmax is a mode that we use when we're looking at doing modelling and sort of the day-to-day activities. So, when you're entering in your monthly updates, like your pasture covers or your animal weights, this is all done in short-term mode. So that means any monitoring or any scenarios that might be looking in the next 3 to 6 months, those sort of decision-making processes are all done in short-term mode in Farmax. And in Farmax short-term mode, it's basically a linear file where at the end of the current year that you're working in, you can extend a file into the following year and add another season on, and you continue your year with whatever the numbers were at the end of the last year. So to explain that a little further, if we had 100 ewes at the start of the season and then 110 at the end of the season, in short-term mode, we then extend the file into the following year and we'll start with the 110 that we had at the end. Now, long-term mode is a bit different, and it's used particularly for big farm system scenario analysis or any high-level system changes. So long-term mode is a bit different because we're not looking at a specific year, we're looking at modeling a farm system's generic year and seeing questions like what kind of carrying capacity could actually be held. So we're not entering actual pasture covers in long-term mode or any actual events, we're just modeling averages. So what we'll do today is take what would be a base short-term file with some actual information, convert it into a long-term mode so that we have a base file for making some bigger, higher-level decisions, and then create a scenario and compare them. So the first thing we'll do is create a new folder to use this Farmax files. So that's done by clicking Folder, New Folder. I'm just going to pop my name in here, and those of you with access to Farmax that are going through this activity, you can do the same thing. You'll have access to these files and you can create your own folder. And then we're going to right click on the base file and duplicate it, and this is now going to be base file long term. So these other three files on the screen have already been created, so I guess they're almost like cheat sheets. And if you're going through and you want to check out those farm files and make sure that you're on the right track, or that you can, your files are looking similar, you're welcome to do that. So I've now clicked on base file Longterm and dragged it into my folder, and we're going to open that one up. So, converting short-term to long-term, there's a number of different rules we want to check. We want to make sure that stock numbers are balanced. We want to make sure that weights of mixed age stock are balanced, that our crops are balanced, and also that we're aging correctly. So the first thing we're going to do is go through and balance the numbers of our mixed age mobs. So we'll start off with cows and the numbers screen. And here we can see that there's an opening number of 175 and a closing of 181. So to balance this mob, we're going to enter two different types of events. Firstly, we're going to enter some sales in January. So you'll see that there's already 3 animals being sold at the very end of Jan, and we're going to create a new sale at the middle of January, and that's going to be 5 animals. And as a reminder, when we're entering in sales, we can select whether they're going to be the heaviest or the lightest animals that we're selling. And you can also select whether it's cows and calf or empty cows. And the same applies for the different mobs that you might enter a sale for. Once we've entered a sale, we get the model's default information, and we can enter override information. We'll keep the model information now. We're currently sitting at 175 opening and 176 closing now. We're also just going to enter 1 death at the end of the season, and that's going to balance our numbers up. So that's cows balanced. The other mixed age mob is our bulls, and we've got an opening of 7 and a closing of 6 because we've got this 1 sale here, so we want to also enter a purchase. And we're going to enter that purchase in October. So instead of clicking new buy, I can just enter a number directly into the screen, and it will create the event. And that's often used particularly if you're entering in deaths and not needing to enter any very specific information. But now that I've entered that purchase, this information has come through, and it's given me the default information for the mob. And now again, we've got a balanced mixed age mob, 7 and 7. Now that our numbers are balanced, we also want to make sure that the weights are balanced. We don't want the animals to have put on or lost 20 kilos at the end of the season. We want it to be an accurate reflection of the animals retaining similar weight profile every year as an average year. So to check our weights, we go into the mob screen again, and this time in performance. And we'll see here that for our cows, we've got them starting off at 550 kilos and ending at 554. So that's pretty close. Happy to leave that there. And if we go into our 1-year heifers, we should be seeing those putting on weight, and the same with our heifer calves and our mixed calves. So that's good. Our bulls we also want to balance out, and you'll see with this mob it's starting off at 750 kilos but closing at 683. So we certainly don't want our bulls losing 70 kilos every year. So we want to adjust the live weights to balance that out. You can adjust the live weights by altering the body weight gain values here, or you can also do it by dragging the dots on the screen, and it's something that we went over with the calibrations in the previous webinar. So I can click and drag this grey dot up, and we'll see now that we're 750 and 745, so that's a bit closer. But also, like I said, we can enter numbers directly in here. So I've just changed that weight loss in September to neutral, and now we're at 748. So quite close there, and now those weights are balanced as well. The other thing to mention while we're looking at live weights, as a reminder, is that when we're editing live weight profiles, we can fix points in the graph. So, for example, if I knew that my animals were definitely going to be around 728 in August, I can select this grey node and it will turn to red, and that means it's now fixed. And if I adjust the curve, it will only just adjust past that point. And that can be quite useful if you're ever in a situation where you've got animals that have quite different growth curves for different parts of the season. Alright, so we've balanced our numbers and we've balanced our weights, but we also want to make sure that our supplements are balanced, because we don't want to be carrying through extra feed every single year. We want it to be a closed system. So to check supplements, we go to the farm level and then the forage and feed screen. And in here we can see the overview of each of the crops or supplementary feeds which are imported and fed on the farm. And so for maize silage, we've produced 288 tonne and we've sold all of that, so that's good. Our silage bales, we've produced 550 and we've fed 533 bales of that to our mobs. And as you'll notice, that's done in this performance screen where we've got our feeding here. And we can see, for example, the cows looks like they're getting most of our silage bales. However, this one isn't balanced, so there's an extra 17.3 bales on the farm that we haven't fed. And so what we could do is we could go through and allocate those to individual mobs. However, if we know that those extra few bales are just going to be distributed to the farm depending on what the needs are at that time, or if it's not going to be super specific and you've already got the standard feeding regime that you're expecting and you're just keeping a few extra, we can feed this extra 17.3 to the farm as an average. And what that means is that this feed is going to be going into the feed budget, so it's still going to be taking in coming in as a feed supply and taking up some of the animal demand, but it's not necessarily going to any individual mobs. Our lease land is fine, and the other one to check here is our hay, and it looks like hay is also not balanced, so again we're just going to feed this one out to farm. And once we've done that, all of our supplements are also balanced. So now that we're happy with our inventories and we're pretty happy with our animal numbers, we can do a quick check, and that's by going to the farm level and the capital value report. So here we can check whether there's any large discrepancies in the capital value change, and that would indicate that there may be still differences in the open and closing between numbers or supplements. So a £2 difference in forage and feeds means we're pretty close. £836 seems a little bit high, but if we put it in the context of over £170,000, it's probably not too much. So quite happy that this file is reasonably balanced. So that means that now we've got everything balanced, we can do the actual conversion to long term. So you see on the right here, it says that the farm is in short term mode. To convert to long term, we go Tools and then select this button here. And easy as that, farm is now long term. I can click OK. And you'll see up here it's now got a long term button. So once we've got everything balanced and we've got a farm in long term, there's one more thing that we want to do, and that's making sure that the aging is done correctly. So going back to the differences between short term and long term, those of you using Farmax and most probably using short term will know that when you're aging through your stock in short term, you can do that through transferring replacements into mixed age mobs, or you can also do it by extending the file into the following year and letting those animals change into their new mobs. So for example, heifer calves for this year, once the file is extended into April 18 to March 19, would become our 1-year heifers. But in long-term mode, the aging is done slightly different. So for any intermediary mobs, for example, our 1-year heifers, which are going to be, they're not born, but they're also not a mixed age mob, so they're going to be aged from. In the properties screen, when we convert to long term, we have this option here. So I can now select age from heifer calves. And if we look at the number screen, so these 26 1-year heifers are now flowing through with the closing number from my heifer calf mob. So these animals are finishing the season at 11 months old, and there's 26 at closing. And those same animals are bringing through their characteristics for the start of April, which is the following year at 12 months old. And this aging from, again, just makes sure that we've got a nice balanced file and that those heifer calves are going to be carrying through their properties each year to the 1-year heifers. However, going into the mixed age mob, we can still do that transfer at the end of the season that we've got here. So we've got a transfer out of 26 going into cows, and that's our replacements coming in. So with all of those steps done, we've now created a base long-term file. So I'm going to save this file and close out of it. So like I mentioned at the start, long-term is great for high-level scenario analysis. So what we're going to do now is check out what would happen if we decided to bring in our replacements later instead of buying in those calves at a couple months old. We're going to look at buying in 1-year heifers at about 20 months old instead, and look at keeping mixed calves and more mixed calves to fatten up and sell. And so this is a relatively big stock policy change for this little system that we've set up. So we'll want to do that as a long-term file. So to make our scenario, we want to right-click on the base file and select duplicate. And we're going to call this one long-term keep more calves. Now we've got an exact copy, we can open this one and we can use it as the base for our scenario. The first tip when we're doing scenarios is always to pop out the pasture screen. So if I go to farm level and then pasture, I can pop out this pasture cover report and resize it, pop it out of the way, and then as I'm making any changes I can understand what the impact's going to be on the pasture cover. So always checking that it's at least feasible physically before looking at the financials. And what we're going to do now to start off working through that sheet, and we're up to point 10 on the activity sheet now, we're going to delete the heifer calf mob to start off with. And when we go to our 1-year heifers, we're going to have an opening number of 0, and we're not going to buy those in until 20 months old in December. So I can click New Purchase, and we're going to purchase those 26 replacements mid-December, or 1st of December, sorry. And the weight of those animals is 470 kilos. And that was done just by checking what the weight was at that age as we'd been growing them normally on the farm. So that's our first step done. We've now reduced or got rid of those calves and the early heifers, and our pasture cover has now popped up, and so we've got more feed in the system, and now we can figure out what we're going to do with that. So I've decided we're going to sell half of our mixed calves in December and then keep the other half on farm to fatten them up and sell them later. So we've already got the sale of 60 in here, but we're going to adjust this to 69. And we're going to delete the sale from February. And what you'll see happen when I delete that is another sale automatically pops up. And being in long term, Farmax wants to stabilize our animal numbers. So that's why sometimes we'll get automatic sales pop up, and in the comment section this is already written for us. And what that means is that Farmax is trying to make sure that because we're in long term, we're not having additional animals stay on farm year on year, which would end up resulting in basically a tornado with more and more animals. So to explain that, if we're closing with 49 and opening with 0 in a mixed stage mob, so we weren't balanced, that would mean that every single year we'd be saying that there's an extra 50 animals on farm, and if we did that 10 years in a row, there's going to be an extra 500 animals on farm. So sometimes these automatic sales will pop up. We're going to leave it there for now and do the next step and then delete that automatic sale. So we've got our mixed calves coming through till 11 months old, but we want to also have an older mob. So I'm going to right click on the enterprise heading, new mob, and create another mixed calf mob. And we're now on the properties screen for these mixed calves, and I can select the aged from button and say aged from mixed calves, and we'll see that that automatically adjusts the age of these animals to 12 months, the month after the closing age for our earlier mob, and we've got this 49 flowing through into the system. We're also going to rename this because the animals that we're keeping are actually going to be the steers, so we're going to call this our R1 steer mob. Now that we've got them named correctly and we've got them aged from, we also want to be selling these animals. So we're going to create a sale in October at 18 months old, and we click new sale, and we're just going to sell all of the animals. And here we're selling 49, but remembering that we've got that other sale in the previous mob that we need to delete. So the reason the best practice is to select all rather than typing in a number here, and this comes up quite often when doing long-term modeling, is that I can now go back to mixed calves, I can delete this sale, and already we're automatically selling the extra animals that pop in the mob. And that's important for situations where there might be an extra death, or your purchase or sale numbers have changed slightly. If you haven't selected all for transactions such as a final sale of a mob, it means that numbers can accidentally flow through and you have to go through and check every time. So definitely best practice when you're doing in a situation like this is to select that all button. And now that we've got all of the numbers correct, we want to figure out what these animals are actually doing, and they're not putting on much weight at the moment, and our plan is to fatten them right up. And the target here is to get them to 400 kilos by the end of September. So again, we can adjust the curve by dragging the grey nodes, and we can also do it by adjusting the numbers in here. So by changing these slightly, we can drop it. So now we've got those animals at 403 kilos at the end of September. So they're now putting on a bit of weight, which is great. And at the same time, if you're noticing in the bottom left-hand corner, by changing the weight and adding in these animals, our pasture cover curve is now dropped back off, and it's got a lot tidier again. And we've now got a new scenario model that we can save. So the last step here, once we've created a scenario, and you can create obviously as many different scenarios as you want, is to go through and compare them. So I'm going to leave the base file long-term with keep more calves open, then we're also going to open the original base file. And now that we've got the two farms open, we've got an extra level has popped up on our tree view in Farmax, and that's the all farms. You would have seen this in any of the previous scenario webinars that we've done. But by clicking on all farms, it opens up a new set of reports, which are the compare reports and the combined reports. So obviously we're going to be looking at the compare reports now, and we've set up these two scenarios using the same base, and we want to figure out which one is the best option for Bowden Farm in the future. So I click on the profit and loss statement. This will give me a breakdown of every single income and expenditure item for both of those scenarios, and I can see the differences that are happening. So for example, we can see that we're getting slightly higher income through sales and purchases with our original base file than our new one. But there's also some differences in the costs. So going down to the bottom farm level, we can see that overall there's a difference of 14,000 between these scenarios, £14,000, and that for this scenario and how we've set it up, the original plan of keeping the heifers and raising them on farm has worked out the most profitable rather than bringing on and aging through the steers. But then we'd be wanting to go through and making sure that our financials are correct, that we've got the right sales values that we'd be expecting and so on, and then yeah, doing final reviews and checks like that. Obviously it's not only financials that's important. We could say that we've got raising 1,000 steers and fattening them right up, but it has to actually be physically feasible as well. So compare reports like the cover report are also quite important to check, and we can see here that the covers are staying relatively similar, with the original base file actually a bit lower at the end of the season, so potentially not quite as much resilience in that system than the new proposed system, and there are higher covers through June, July, getting close to 3,000, which might also indicate a bit of inefficiency in pasture management. So some opportunities to tidy up, and some opportunities to check whether there's any other differences we can change to the farm system to improve that bottom line. So to check some of those things, for example, if we're wanting to look at the financials in more detail, we can do that in the expenses database. And at the moment, UK expenses plan has been used, which is the default expense plan. But you can go through and adjust any of these values in the expense plan. So for example, if I knew that my wages were exactly £9,000, I can go through and enter and adjust those values. It's also important to check when we're doing scenarios that we've got items such as animal health done correctly. So we can either use the model for animal health costs, or you might decide to do it at a per stock unit basis. But you don't want that to be at a total value. So if we'd put animal health at 4,000 and then we were running a scenario where we had more animals or less animals, we'd want the model to be able to reflect that. So instead, we fix the number for animal health per stock unit. So now I've put in £2.20 per stock unit, and that means that as our animal numbers change, we can also see the reflection in the animal health costs. So that's the expense database, and the only other thing to mention here is you can create multiple different expense spreadsheets. So I can create duplicates, and I could write, rather than just using the default, I can make my own one. And you can also create these for scenarios. So I could create a duplicate which is expenses plus 10% if I wanted to check my financial feasibility if costs are going to be increasing on farm and so on. And if we do change any expenses, we can apply those new databases that we've created at the farm properties level. And you'll see this new one that we've created, Bowden Farm Expenses, has popped up. So that brings us to the end of this practical part of the webinar, we've gone through and we've created our base long-term farm. We've created a scenario and we've been able to compare them. And also just checking over some of those last tweaks or areas that you'd want to check over when using Farmax for any decision making. So thank you very much for tuning in, and as always, welcome any questions, and obviously any follow-up questions via email or call, definitely get in touch.
Thanks, Jack. So in terms of, if anybody wants to write any questions, just go to the panel on the right-hand side and just type them in. But just, you sort of hinted at some, but what are the, when you're doing scenarios in this way, what are the sort of common mistakes that we just need to look out for, or queries, really?
That's a really good question. So first thing is making sure those things that we've ticked off the list, like the mobs balancing, and if we're in long term and we've got an unbalanced mob, if we didn't balance it properly at the start, you'll see a yellow banner will pop up, open and close numbers not balanced. So checking all those balancing and those basic things is a first check. And then if we're using the farm for financials, it's going through what we were just doing then and making sure the proper per hectare and per stock units are applied. And lastly, also checking out the standard modeling details, so your crops and feeds databases. For example, we've got some maize silage in here, so we want to go through and check that our pricing or our yield information there is correct. So basically, the same sort of stuff you'd be checking in short term, plus the things that we've been through today.
And then some of the frustration I've had in the past is that you're generating that long-term model, or you're doing your scenarios, and then you find something that isn't quite right, and then especially if you've done multiple scenarios, you have to then remember to go back and change it all in. Anyway, that's my experience.
Yes,
sometimes.
that's exactly right. So it definitely pays to triple check that first base model before you go making scenarios. Otherwise, like you say, there may be some mistakes in all of those scenarios. The one thing to remember is, if, for example, you've made a mistake where you haven't put in maybe your expenses correctly yet, and you go to do that at the end, you don't actually have to do that in every single file. So another thing that I can show you is this import button in Tools. So to run through that situation, if I'd created my 3 or 4 different scenarios but decided I had forgotten to change the expenses correctly, rather than having to make this and adjust my wages or my animal health in every single one, you can go Tools, Import from Farmax file, and I can select any Farmax file, including different farms or different scenarios that I've made. And by selecting that farm, it now pops up with different items that I can import. So I can import the different expenses databases, or I can import different contracts or different blocks, or even different enterprise setups. So that's a nice quick way to get files to be accurate and balanced again if you might have forgotten something at the start. I think you might be muted at the moment, Liz, because I can't hear anything at the moment.
I am muted. So in terms of what do you think is the maximum number of scenarios that you could do within a report before it starts to get a bit difficult to interpret?
I don't think there is one. The main limitation you'd have with multiple scenarios is that you'd start running out of room on the screen. So no, I think the opportunities with running scenarios are endless. You could have unlimited different scenarios, but when you're creating the different scenarios, it's important to try not to make too many changes in a single file, especially when you first start off modeling. So if we're looking at changing stock policy or looking at making a scenario and we're looking at differences for nitrogen, for cropping, for animal numbers, don't really want to do that all in one farm at the start, because then it gets difficult to identify which were the main farm system changes providing benefit or disadvantages. So the general process when we're making scenarios is to change one small thing at a time for each scenario, and then once you've made a few different files, to start combining them. So at the end, you might put in things like combining a new nitrogen policy with a new cropping policy and a new stock policy.
And
sorry.
also have a very good way of naming them so you can understand what you've done in each one would be my top tip.
Absolutely, making sure that you're being very clear with your naming. And so we can open more than 2 farms at the same time, and they'll also all pop up in the compare reports. We just lose that difference column because there's more than 2 farms, but you can still compare all of them if you open more than 2 at a time.
So we've had a comment from David Canty just saying really helpful as always, and then we've got a question from James Daniel, which is morning Jack. He's aware of the time difference. So he's modelling 600 kilo plus mature age cows and their calves, which is a UK issue in terms of mature size. The current feed model has them losing weight. The advice has been to use the mature weight adjustment percentage to enable them to maintain weight. Any other tips and a timescale on the correction to the model?
Yeah, that's a good question, but as you said, you've pretty much answered it already. At the moment, the way to go about that is to go into this adjustments and to change that mature weight percentage. And once you've done that, not only will it alter the default, so you'll be changing the body weight gains or live weights here, but it also allows a lot more flexibility in how much you can change it. So prior to changing a mature weight adjustment, I'll be a lot more limited in how high or how low I can change my body weight gains. And after adjusting that mature weight adjustment figure, you can then enter in a lot higher numbers. In terms of when those defaults won't be popping up losing weight, that's going to be something that will be reviewed probably by the end of this year or the start of January, going through with the schedules database and those live weight profiles.
And as you say, it's just one of those well, delightful things you just have to remember to do, don't you, as you're setting up files really and just adjusting that weight. And it appears to work quite well once you have adjusted that weight percentage. Okay.
Yeah, you'll always be wanting to make sure that the weights are correct because it's very important for what the animal demand is going to be. So yeah, you should always be checking weights anyway, and if you are running into that issue, that's when you can pop into the mature weight.
And there's also, I suppose, it's quite evident, isn't it, which is in that live weight graph, is that because you've changed it, you've just got a greater range in that axis, haven't you? So it's also, you start to see it squashed right to the top, and then that's time where you've got to make that adjustment.
Exactly. The one thing you want to be wary of is you don't want to be too silly with that mature weight adjustment percentage. I wouldn't be changing it any higher than what I'd got in there, 250%. If you start putting in silly numbers, then it will cause some inaccuracies in the model because it's saying that the animals can get up to 2,000 kilos or something, and the amount that they're eating for maintenance and so on will start causing some issues. So yeah, probably don't be changing it more than 250%, but that should give you plenty of room to work with.
And it's intriguing, so on the sheep side, it would probably be, what, 150 you'd have to increase it to? It wouldn't be quite as that dramatic, would it?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Okay. There's no other questions that have come through, but thanks again, Jack. And we haven't confirmed in terms of what the next series of webinars are, but when we have, we will send some details around. So thanks again for people to tune in, and we will see you again. Thanks a lot, Jack.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, everyone.